Okay. I'm Frank Massey, and I'm here interviewing my good friend Costa Maletskos. The purpose of this interview is for the archives of the Health Physics Society, the effort being to archive prominent health physicists and get their input on videotape while they are still available to us. We are at the annual meeting of 2001 in Cleveland, Ohio on June 13th, 2001. Welcome, Costa.
Thank you, Frank.
We are, as you know, going through this videotape at this time, and we would like to take it through from beginning to end. I know you don't remember when you learned how to speak English.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell us?
That's an important thing to bring up.
That is. So why don't you, I'm always fascinated by your early childhood days. Why don't you fill us in, because I think it's amazing.
Well, my parents were immigrants that came from Greece. Mm-hmm. And as all immigrants, they lived with friends and families until they got their feet on the ground well. And eventually I was born and my sister were born. And in all this time, being close with the family, we spoke the language of the family.
Yes.
And nothing else.
You were born in this country?
I was born in Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay.
And we didn't interact very much with anybody else during this period. But I do remember one of the earliest remembrances of going to kindergarten. And it was a mixed group of people that I would talk about integration. We were really integrated there, including blacks, Spanish, and everything else you can think of, Italians, Irish, the works. And I don't remember knowing any English when I went in. And when I came out of kindergarten and went to first grade, I had no problem speaking English. Now, I've checked with my relatives, my friends, who were all in the same boat, and they all say the same thing. We do not remember learning how to speak the language. I feel very strongly about that because of all the bilingual work that is going on. I think that's going to lead to trouble later on. We're getting now enclaves in Florida and in the Southwest where they're going to be only Mexicans and only Spanish. And what you're going to do is develop small countries within the country, and that's going to be very divisive. I don't like that at all. Mm-hmm. And all the bilingual work that's going on, I think, is useless. One of the problems is there's so many people that have to be taught, but I think you control that by controlling immigration rate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other thing too, that the Greek families that I've known in Gloucester and along the North Shore of Massachusetts, they maintain their language, but they do it through the church, and
That's
do it on.
You learn the language of the country you're living in. If you want to keep any other languages, that's up to you.
Yeah, yeah. So, and you have maintained your Greek, I know, over the years.
Not as well as I would like it to be at this stage of the game. But
well, tell us a little bit about your schooling.
Well, my parents finally moved out to where the medical area in Boston is, where Harvard Medical School and so forth. Mm-hmm. That was country then.
Yeah.
And they moved there and didn't go where a lot of the other Greek people went, into Brighton and Austin, which are further suburbs of actually Boston, because there were three good schools in the area. And if you think of the spokes of a wheel, there was a primary school, a good primary school, a good grammar school, which was torn down, is now the Harvard School of Public Health, mm-hmm. and the Boston Latin School.
Right, okay.
So, and you could walk to them.
Okay.
And that was probably the smartest thing that they ever did. Whether they did it deliberately or not, I don't know, but it worked out very fine. I ended up going to Boston Latin School, which is still probably the finest school in the country. Mm-hmm. The first school long before Harvard University itself, and they still have exceedingly high standards. And the standards were so high that, in effect, I walked into MIT. Mm-hmm. I took the college, what were called the college boards in those days, in my junior year, but did not have to take the college boards in my senior year because my grades were high enough so I could literally walk into MIT.
Excellent, excellent. And that began a rather interesting career.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it is that I went into MIT with the idea that I would marry electrical engineering and medicine. I don't know why I had that idea, or biomedicine, or whatever you want. It was medicine in those, because I couldn't think about biomedicine in those days.
Yeah.
Now, what made me do that, I have no idea. That was my idea to do so. So I started off by being in the electrical engineering department as a freshman. But during that whole year, I realized that they were interested only in electric power. This was in the days when the electrical engineering department really only handled electric power.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see how I was going to get out of that and move on to the next step without just becoming a power engineer instead of what I wanted to be, at least in my own mind. So I worked my way through during the next 2 or 3 years through various departments, and they had one department which was called General Sciences, and I'm glad they did, because that allowed me to make the transition to go from just plain engineering or physics to biology as well, and I ended up in the biology department. And so I ended up with what was a 5-year course in the biology department, where on the 4th year, which is my graduating year, I got a degree in quantitative biology. And then, that was now in 1942, World War II had just started. And I automatically, being in the ROTC, normally if I had graduated at that point, I left MIT, I would have become an officer and I've been immediately in the service. For reasons that I don't know, the Army made me a private and wanted me to finish my schooling, which is unusual.
Okay.
And I had nothing to do with it. I just was told that this was that I was now I was a buck private with a buck private uniform and going for my 5th year at MIT, and then got my master's degree in biophysics.
Okay.
And this was the beginning of this whole eventually going through that. And then following that, I went into the service, and I was interviewed because of my dual language by what was then the CIA, which was called the Office of Strategic Services, and for reasons that I don't know why they interviewed me in the first place, or they decided they didn't need me, I was sent to officer candidate school. And finishing that, I was immediately sent back to Harvard to get all my knowledge of radar because of my electrical engineering background.
Okay.
And so that's how I spent the war, being a battalion radar officer for a little while, and most of it in El Paso at the anti-aircraft artillery school teaching radar.
Oh, okay. Very good.
And that was an interesting episode. There were a bunch of us were gung-ho types. We were all in the same boat, and we taught enlisted men's courses and officers' courses. And we did everything and gave tests and graded the tests and gave a final value to the test. We did this to the enlisted men. We did this to the to the officers.
To your senior officers.
And I tell you what, we flunked officers. Oh, and the general of the camp got wind of it, and the message came back: "You guys can grade them, but you guys can mark them, but I'll put the final grade on." But it was interesting, though. The people who complained were the ones that must have not wanted to be there, because we had colonels who were in there who were ready to be a student and do everything that they were told to do, like go up above and check that antenna or something like that, and they just climb right up and everything else.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
They were the ones that were really interested in learning.
Sure. Yeah. And that's important.
Yeah.
Now, you drifted back to MIT shortly after that.
Well,
never lost your contact, basically.
I actually got out of the service by an unusual way. I was on my way to, this was after VE Day in Europe, and I was on my way to the Pacific Theater and was traveling with a battalion of enlisted people that were going to be taken over to the theater, and we ended up in Seattle, and from there we went to Alaska. And from Alaska they were going to be flown over. Well, while I was in Alaska, a message came through from MIT that they wanted me to come back. Well, that was surprising, because I didn't know what I could do to come back. And it turns out they wanted me to join what they called the bomb laboratory, where they were looking for new ways to make bombs and how to explode them and so forth. and become responsible for the physics part of it. Now, I didn't know the first thing about a bomb, but here they go. I'm invited to come back. So I stayed there for about a year and a half and realized that MIT was not going to, the services were not going to continue the bomb lab much longer. It was a good idea, but they decided to change. So I decided I better make a motion to go back to and become a graduate student and continue with my career.
Okay. All right. And you were then trying to decide which direction you were going to take with that graduate approach.
Yeah, and I started out in the biology department,
right,
where it had been decimated because of the war. There were no students, nothing. All the laboratories were just put on rest, you might say. And I was a research, not a teaching assistant at the time also. Mm-hmm. And I had to put together 2 laboratories from scratch, enzymology and biophysics. And I ended up doing the first 2 experiments with radioactivity in the biophysics laboratory. It was interesting because I wanted to show the kids how fast inhalation allows you to get it into the systemic system.
Yeah.
So we rigged up a technique of making an aerosol, having the rats breathe it, and then sacrificing them so the head would be out of the way, and then measure what's left in the body. And boy, it is rapid.
Yeah.
And at the time, the department was interested in red cell membranes, and didn't know how, what the mechanics. This is early studies in membrane physiology. So I rigged up an experiment with radioactive potassium and radioactive sodium to determine what the flow rate across the membranes was.
Okay.
And those were 2 pretty good experiments.
Well, you had the advantage at that stage in the game of the cyclotron too, so you could.
That's where everything came from.
Cyclotron number 2.
But we really ought to go back one step, a couple of years before that, and that is in my senior year between 1942 and the beginning of the fall year of 1942, which became the year of 1943.
Yeah.
I decided I wanted to learn more science in a practical way, just like you had been doing that way. So I went scouting around at the Institute to see what jobs were available for the summer. And I ran into 3 jobs that I thought was interesting. And the one that really caught my attention was a job that Robley D. Evans had for me. And, that is the beginning of our association, which became my life and everything else. And it's fortuitously probably one of the great decisions I made of going with him. And during that summer, I built the first 2 commercial count rate meters. And by commercial, I mean they were not built just for the use in the academy. They were built to be used by a company for rapid determination of the quartz crystals for cleaving them to make oscillators for receivers. And they used X-rays and a GM counter to move it around, and then you look for the counting rate, and you found the peak for that particular lattice that you were looking for.
Okay.
And I built them from scratch and designed the circuit diagrams and all that, checked them out and everything else, and off they went. At that time, it was all classified, so nobody knew anything about it.
Okay.
I also helped build the first automatic sample changer, because the Radioactivity Center at the time, and I didn't know it, was working on blood preservation for the war's effort. Mm-hmm. And the object was that blood could be preserved only for about a week, but that wasn't enough to send blood over either to Europe or to the Pacific, because it wouldn't last, and it wouldn't do anybody any good. And the object was to extend that time to as long as it could be, and that was the major effort that was going on. That's why they needed sample changes, because they had so many samples you couldn't count them by hand anymore.
Sure, yeah.
So that became it, and from that original system, the company Tracelab came into being for making these sort of things on a commercial basis.
Yeah, wow. Names out of the past. That was the beginning of your relationship with Robley.
Right, and then when I finished my a couple of years at the biology department, and had taken my writtens and froze on my orals. I don't know why I froze on them. It's the only one and only time in my life I ever froze. And I was debating, and the department was debating what was going to happen. I think somebody in the department talked to Robley Evans, because the next thing I know, he calls me up and he says, "Come on down here, I want to talk to you." And so he calls me down and tells me that he wants me to run the show for the biomedical aspect of the Radioactivity Center, which was a good fraction of the Radioactivity Center. And he would arrange for all the, whatever the necessities would be for me to get my graduate work done. But he convinced me, and I cannot remember to this day while that conversation, that I should do it in 3 fields, a PhD in 3 fields: biology, chemistry, and physics. And I did it. I did it without batting an eyelash. He set up a department, in quotes, which consisted of members of 3 departments, and that was my department.
Yeah.
And each of the 3 groups handled me as a separate, equivalent separate student. So I ended up with 3 writtens, 3 orals, a thesis that had everything in it, and then 3 departments questioning for my defense of the thesis.
Right. Yeah. And to the best of our knowledge, you are the only person to hold a triple PhD from MIT.
That's what Evans is saying. I haven't personally checked it, but I haven't heard anybody else doing it either.
No, it's incredible.
The only thing
it took a while.
Well, you see,
you were working.
I was working full time.
Right. Yeah.
I was a research associate, which was the lowest faculty rank at the time. I was a research associate without a PhD, and that rankled an awful lot of other research associates, but I was the senior research associate.
Yeah.
And we did some fantastic stuff that we can talk about if you want.
Sure.
During that period of about 6 years when I was working full-time and then trying to get my PhD.
Right.
But I have to admit that Charles Coriel, who was a very good humanitarian as well as a very good scientist, would talk to his potential examinees, if you want to call it that, and he was one of the members representing the chemistry group, would talk to people, to students, and explain to them what an oral was all about. And I think that was probably the most comforting thing that happened. I decided I wasn't going to study. I either knew everything or I was not going to.
Right.
I might check a few things, but I wasn't. I've been working for 6 years in all 3 aspects of the whole of these fields. So I figured either I knew it or I didn't know it. And he said, "What we want to know is how well you know something.
Yep.
How well you know not so well. And finally, how big is that radius where you don't know?"
Yeah.
And that's what we want to know. We don't want to know really what you want to know. We want to know how good you are in terms of quality and everything else as far out as you can.
Yeah.
And knowing that, I went in without batting an eyelash, and it was really unusual because all 6 of them were sitting at a table mixed up. And Evans asked them to go ring around the rosy, and you jump from one field to another field to back and forth. And I knew all the people. I had worked with them all the time.
Sure.
So here they were examining me. And it was an interesting period.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it was, yeah. Now, when you finished up, you stayed at Radioactivity Center
for a couple of years. And then finishing up a number of things that were still going.
The cyclotron was still operating, and so you were working with the cyclotron at that stage in the game. The cyclotron had been built in 1939 as the second cyclotron
in the world. You're right.
And so that was an unusual opportunity for you there. But then
let's make a point about that cyclotron, which is very interesting. That was built by funds that came from a medical foundation.
Yes. Yeah.
And the priority on that cyclotron was medical work and biological work and not physics. Physics was second.
Yes, I know.
That's what's interesting.
Well, and the I-131 that developed thyroid treatment at Mass General came from that.
That's right, exactly. Right, exactly.
Right.
And all the studies on the blood preservation came from, that's where they made their iron 59 and iron 55.
Yes.
Because they eventually got to using triple tracers.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, and Evans always made a point that for every extra tracer you use, you get 10 times more knowledge.
Yes, yeah.
And he was right.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's incredible. In the meantime, MIT was thinking about a research reactor.
That's correct.
And that was in the late 50s.
Mid-50s
that the planning was laid.
Right,
And it was built in the latter part of that decade, and you became involved in that.
Yeah, well, Harriet was, Harriet Hardy, who was the head of occupational medicine, got involved in that because she knew there was going to be some radiation protection requirements.
Yeah.
So she asked me if I would, join that group, which was involved Tommy Thompson, who was the director of the whole thing, and all his crew, and asked me to see if I would take over the radiation protection of the reactor. And remember, this was a first reactor in the middle of a suburban area.
That's right, yeah.
And it's interesting that I worked on the first reactor in the middle of a suburban area, and then the first power reactor, which was Yankee.
Yeah.
And so I had to start from scratch, is what it amounted to, and help design. A lot of the shielding had already been decided, but then there were a lot of other things that had to be worked out. And nobody had done any significant environmental work, and the question is, what did we know about the environment outside? And that was one of the major items that had to be developed so they could be done simply and economically. My theory is always economics has got to enter in there, and that means you've got to use your brain.
Yes.
And the system I set up is still going on, which is amazing, except for better detectors and a few other things.
And you still serve on the reactor safeguards.
Yeah, I'm the oldest person on the thing from the beginning until now.
That's right. The only continuous member from day one.
That's from about 1956 on.
That's right.
Man, I didn't realize it.
Yeah, right.
And in the beginning, all the people that worked at the reactor, for example, were checked out at the whole body counter at the radioactivity center and all that. We started all that kind of thing going on. And by that, then eventually you had your chair, so we didn't need to use that's high sensitivity of the whole body counter. And there were a lot of other things that I set up. For example, how do you know your monitors are reading, your monitors which control what leaves the building, how do you know that they're reading the right thing? And can they detect fast enough so when the time comes time to close a damper, will it close on time and nothing will get out? Nobody had addressed that question ever before that I was aware of. So I had to develop techniques for making radioactive argon, because that's what you're going to be having mostly all the time, and use that as the gaseous component of what's going out. And then I had to develop, do you remember Fred Viles, who was the head of industrial hygiene? Yeah. Well, he and I got together because what I had to do is I had to make a radioactive aerosol. And the easiest thing to make it at the cyclotron was sodium chloride.
Right.
So we had radioactive sodium and radioactive chlorine. And we had to make a fine, floating, small particle diameter aerosol that would, go through like the regular things would go through. And to do that, you had to use a nebulizer. But if you used a nebulizer and didn't recover what came out, which were the rocks, then you would have to start off with this ferocious amount of radioactivity. You couldn't even get near the place. So I developed what I call a recycling nebulizer. So all the rocks came back and went back into the pool. All the very fine stuff got out. Fred said the best way to make sure that we got what we want is to take them through traps, so that whatever the little rocks were left would stay in the trap and then go out. And that's what we did, and we showed that the damper could not close adequately in time, and that we had to have more plenum distance in the exhaust system to give you time enough to prevent it from getting out. So they added all they could in the basement of the reactor where all this equipment is, and that was still not enough. And there was a large cylindrical connection between the reactor building and where the filters were in the bottom of the stack. And the person who designed it calculated what that volume would handle, and it would be okay. But with a jet coming out and immediately aiming to the other opening, you weren't using the volume. Okay. So Fred and I designed a perforated baffle, which would allow you at the beginning to spread that air over the whole cross-section of that cylinder, and then come out, and then we made it.
Okay.
But that's the first and only time that a building is calibrated by using the whole building.
Yeah. And by the release of radioactive material before the
Yeah,
reactor was operating.
Exactly.
And also taking advantage of the fact that since it was cyclotron produced, you didn't have to get any permission from anybody to release it.
Exactly.
So no, that's a wonderful
But that's called
example.
thinking.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I did do that was interesting is I wanted to, by that time we had the Y12 accident, and they had talked about trying to determine the dose by the sodium that was induced in the body of the subject. So I thought we better do some measurements with neutrons and see what we can determine. And while the reactor was in its beginning power stages, I arranged, there was one entry section from the top of the reactor down through the thermal column that looked at the core and got neutrons coming up. So I got a thesis student to do some work with radiating dogs, because they are the closest to a human being. That would be easy.